Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video, where this week I've got a story for you that I haven't been able to stop thinking about ever since I first read an article about it. It's a story of abduction, mixed identity, self-discovery, and it's been recently blown wide open by the advances in DNA technology. It's a really crazy case. Our story starts on the 26th of April 1964 when Chester and Dora Fronczak give birth to a baby boy in the Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, and they name this baby boy Paul Joseph Fronczak. Paul's their first child and they're both so excited, so over the moon to have this baby boy. Dora's nursing him at every single opportunity, and when she's not nursing him, he is away in the nursery with the other babies sleeping. But whenever she can, Dora's got this baby in her arms. So they stay in hospital the day he's born and overnight, and the next morning Dora is in her room feeding the baby when a nurse comes in and says to her that they just need to take the baby off for some tests with the doctor. Just routine tests, he'll be right back. So Dora, not thinking anything of it, hands the baby over to this nurse, or at least someone she thinks is a nurse, because that nurse walks out holding the baby and neither of them ever return. It doesn't take the hospital staff long to realise that something's up and this baby has been taken, so they immediately contact the authorities. But by this point, baby Paul and the woman are long gone. What ensues is the biggest manhunt in California's history. They had 200 officers marching the streets, knocking on every door they could, mostly in Chicago's South Side, just looking for this baby, looking for this woman. The FBI even got involved. They searched 600 homes that day and interviewed over 1,000 people by midnight on that very same day. Chicago's postal workers also got involved, with 175,000 postal workers walking through the streets, knocking on every single door, looking for any clue whatsoever. The very next day, the headline on Chicago Tribune's front page was "Baby Stolen at Hospital." Everyone in Chicago knew what was going on. From Dora's description, they were looking for a woman in her mid-30s to mid-40s, about 5'4", about 140 pounds, and she had very close-set brown eyes. Whilst the outside world is searching for the baby, Dora and Chester remain in hospital for the next week. They're just hoping that somebody would bring the baby back, but of course they don't. They never have any luck, and eventually the case just quietens down, as it always does. Every single place the authorities try to look, it was just a dead end. There was no leads whatsoever. Nobody had a clue. It was like this woman and this baby had just disappeared into thin air. Chester and Dora tried to return back to their normal life. They don't hear anything at all. And then 2 years later, in July 1965, an abandoned toddler is found in his buggy out the front of a department store in Newark, New Jersey. Now, nobody immediately makes the link back to the Fronczaks, and this boy is placed into the system, where he is then fostered by a family called the Eckerts. Now, the Eckerts were incredibly fond of this baby boy, and they even baptised him. At this baptism, they named him Scott McKinley. Now, baby Scott stayed with them for many months, and they were so fond of him that they were actually on the brink of adopting him. But before they could start the adoption process, a New Jersey detective had a hunch. And this hunch was that this abandoned boy could be the missing baby from Chicago. I mean, their ages about matched up, and he thought it was worth looking into, so he contacts the FBI, who agree and start their own investigation. But there wasn't really much for investigators to go on. Baby Paul, like I said, was barely a day old when he was taken, and the hospital hadn't yet made any records of his fingerprint, his footprints. They hadn't drawn any blood from him. And of course, this was the 60s, so there was no DNA technology they could use, and so there just wasn't much to go on, apart from one single photo. In the time the baby was missing, the FBI had tested over 10,000 boys that could have possibly been Paul. Scott McKinley was the only boy of these 10,000 that couldn't be entirely ruled out, and this was based on the shape of his ear. The shape of Scott's ear and the shape of baby Paul's ears were very similar, and so they thought it could be him. So in 1966, the Fronczaks receive a letter from the FBI who say that they think they found their missing son. 3 months later, the Fronczaks drive out to New Jersey to meet this child. I mean, imagine being in the Fronczak's shoes at this point. You've had your child stolen off you, who's barely a day old. You have nothing you can do about it. You're entirely helpless. And then you've got the FBI, the highest authority at the time, telling you that this random boy is your son. And without DNA testing, there was no way they could know for certain. They just had to go by their gut feeling. And this was a hugely high profile case. Like I said, everyone in Chicago knew about it, but everyone pretty much across the country knew about it. And the entire country had their eye on the Fronczaks. Could the Fronczaks really go out there to New Jersey, look at this boy and just say, no, it's not our son? Would they ever forgive themselves if it turned out he was? So they look at the boy and they decide that this is their missing son, and they accept him as their own, and they take him back to Chicago. Now this boy is Paul Joseph Fronczak. I don't know if the FBI truly believed that this child was indeed Paul Fronczak, but like I said, this was a hugely high profile case, and they probably just wanted to get the case closed because it would look good on them. And so here they are, they have this abandoned child and they don't know who this child belongs to. They have this family who's missing their child, and so they kind of put two and two together, and that's it, case closed, problem solved. So this little boy now grows up as Paul Fronczak, and Paul would go on to say that he had a very happy childhood. His childhood was brilliant in every way. Paul said his parents, Dora and Chester, were absolutely wonderful, if slightly overprotective, as you would be if your child had been kidnapped and then returned to you. You're gonna be overprotective. But of course he grew up with no idea what happened in his early years. As far as he knew, Dora and Chester were his parents, there'd been nothing that happened, and he'd just grown up a very normal child. It wasn't until he was 10 years old that he had a clue that something was a little bit off. He said that one day he was searching in the attic for his Christmas presents, and he comes across a box, and in this box he finds all of these different newspaper clippings, sympathy cards, letters, all about the kidnap of Paul Fronczak. He's 10 years old, he's reading all this and he knows it's about him, so he goes down to his mother and asks her about what he'd found. And he said that she was actually slightly angry at him for snooping around. She didn't really want to talk about it. And so she simply said to him, you were kidnapped, we found you, we love you. That's all you need to know. And they didn't talk about it again for many years. But Paul said he always knew that something wasn't quite right. He didn't look anything like his parents. He didn't look anything like his younger brother, Dave. His personality just didn't quite match up with theirs. He was a rocker, he had long hair, he loved music, he was slightly rebellious, and the rest of his family were all like solid Catholics, they're all very clean cut. And he said that he loved his family, he just never felt like he fitted in. After he graduates from high school, Paul moves out of Chicago and becomes a bass player with a rock band in Arizona. And he worked many different jobs over the years, and he eventually settles in Las Vegas, Nevada, where him and his wife would go on to have a daughter. And he said that it was only with the birth of his daughter did he begin to really realise how much genetics play a part in who you are. He said that he noticed so many similarities between himself and his daughter that he just never really felt with his parents. And I'm not talking about just physical similarities, but personality-wise as well. I think people really underestimate how much genetics play a part in your personality, who you basically are as a person. For example, I am like my dad in every single way. I look like him, I act like him, I speak like him. Me and my dad are so similar. And I've always wondered how much of that is genetics and how much of that is nurture. For decades, the thought of who Paul really was just this thought in the back of his head. He never really acted on it. He'd thought about DNA testing, but it just wasn't really something that was common. It was hard to do, it was really expensive. But as DNA testing became more common, more popular in more recent years, it was something that had crossed Paul's mind occasionally. That was until 2012, where Paul, who's now 47 years old, is in a store in CVS and he spots an over-the-counter DNA testing kit. And so he buys it on the spot and heads home. But now he had this kit, he just had to pluck up the courage to ask his parents to do it with him. It was when they were visiting him from Chicago. He's about to go and drop them at the airport and he knows that he's got to ask them now or he's going to miss his chance. So he just says to them, like, have you ever wondered if I'm your real son? And they sort of have a conversation, and Dora and Chester agree straight away to do this DNA test. So they do the test, they swab their cheeks, they put it back in the packaging, and Paul drives them to the airport. It's only when they land at the other side does Paul get a call from Dora and Chester saying that they changed their mind, they didn't want him to send the test off. So he simply puts the test in his desk drawer, but he can't stop thinking about it. He knows that he's got to do this test for himself, he has to know who he is, and so he sends the test off. It returns a couple of weeks later with results he'd always kind of suspected. He was not the biological son of Dora and Chester Fronczak. He writes a letter to his parents explaining the results, and he hoped that them seeing the words written down would help them understand his thought process and his feelings, but they were understandably furious. They felt as if this meant that Paul was now going to be replacing them with his own biological parents, but that wasn't the case. Paul now had a mission, and that was to help his parents reunite with their real son, with the real Paul Fronczak. He wanted answers, but his parents actually refused to speak to him for over a year after this. I've got a quote here from Paul that said, "You've got to understand, the main reason I did this was to find my parents' real child. They were the most amazing parents. The best gift I could give them would be to find their kidnapped child, and I thought the best way to do that would be to invoke the help of the media." And that's what he did. He went straight to the media in Las Vegas and he went public with his story. And the biggest consequence of going public was that the FBI finally reopened the Fronczak case. They located 10 boxes of the original case files in Chicago, and they started to look into the case again. And Paul wanted to get involved, he wanted to help, but the irony is that now he had proven that he wasn't Paul Fronczak, he now wasn't allowed to have access to any of these cold case files, so he was kind of just cut out of it. He starts to make TV appearances, he appears on the news, he appears twice on 2020, just in the search for answers, and he's actually connected with a genealogist on 2020 called CC Moore, and CC's team takes on Paul's case free of charge, and they basically want to help him find his true biological identity. They use commercial databases such as 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA in an attempt to find any link between his DNA and anybody on any of these sites. They analysed every aspect of his DNA and used a combination of DNA testing and just classic investigative techniques like searching old newspapers, interviewing people, trawling through social media. They just wanted to find anything they could because somebody somewhere out there had this missing child. Somebody knew that he would have been abandoned. Through his DNA, it was determined that Paul had Ashkenazi Jewish, Italian and Eastern European roots. And from this, the genealogist basically knew that on either side, he basically had to have a 100% Jewish grandparent. Paul's DNA eventually begins to match with very, very distant relatives across these sites, and so Cece begins to study the family trees. She basically reverse engineers Paul's own family tree just from pulling these very, very distant relatives out of nowhere. I know there's a lot of controversy now around these DNA tests, around just submitting your DNA to these random people to test, and I kind of get why, but for stories like this, it's incredible what people can do. I've submitted my own DNA to 23andMe and it linked me to relatives all across the world. I have so much family in the USA, so many third, fourth cousins, and I just think it's incredible that that technology is available to people nowadays. On June 3rd, 2015, Cece calls Paul and asks him, "What do you think of the name Jack?" It quickly transpires that Cece has found out who Paul Fronczak really is. Paul's real name, his birth name, was Jack Rosenthal, and Cece had been able to track this down through all of these family trees. But that wasn't everything. Jack Rosenthal had a twin sister called Jill, and Jill had disappeared as a baby and had never been found. She remains missing to this day. Through research and interviews with all of these extended family members, it was discovered that the Rosenthals were not a great family. They weren't the ideal family by any means. There was a lot of abuse in this family and there were secrets kept on every single side. One cousin had memories of these twins, these babies, crying. They were trapped in a cage. They just cried all the time. And eventually the twins just disappeared and nobody questioned it, because the twins' parents told one side of the family that the other side was looking after them, and told that side the other side were looking after them. And nobody ever really bothered to look for them. Paul believes that the answer to why he was abandoned lies in the answer to what happened to Jill. He believes that something bad happened to Jill. Perhaps she died, perhaps she was killed by her parents, and in order to cover up, the parents decided they had to get rid of Jack. How were they just going to explain one twin? But he's not bitter about it. He said that he believes being abandoned is the best thing his parents could ever have done for him. It was clearly a very abusive, very unhappy family, and then he was abandoned and he lives with the Eckharts for a bit, and then he goes to live with the Fronczaks, and he had an amazing upbringing, a really good life, which probably wouldn't have happened if he'd stayed with the Rosenthals. Everything about Paul's life changed from the moment he discovered he was really Jack Rosenthal. He was now 6 months older than he thought, his ancestry was different, his medical history was different. Who he fundamentally thought he was entirely different. He thought he was Catholic, but he's Jewish. But now Paul had the answer as to who he really was, but it just opened up more questions. What happened to Jill, and where is the real Paul Fronczak? They still don't know the answer to that. As of today, it doesn't seem like he's found them, but he's still searching. Whoever took baby Paul walked into the hospital with the aim of taking a baby, perhaps with the intent of selling the baby or keeping the baby for themselves. Maybe it was a mother who had recently lost a child, was grieving, wasn't thinking straight, and so just decided to take one. It's not crazy to think that the real Paul Fronczak may have actually grown up in a perfectly happy childhood with perfectly nice parents, and he possibly had no idea what happened to him as a baby. I mean, even if he was taken with the intent of being sold, he may have been sold to a family that just really, really wanted a child to love. Or it could be darker than that. A private investigator assigned to the case believes that he may have possibly tracked down the bodies of both Jill and Paul, and he is planning on exhuming them to find out the truth. But of course this is a very lengthy process and a very expensive process, and as far as I could tell, that hasn't actually been done yet. These apparently come from the best leads that they have, which involved a man who passed away in Texas many years ago. There is actually one really interesting theory about what may have happened to Paul, including a woman known as the welfare queen, Linda Taylor. Now Linda Taylor, I don't even know if Linda Taylor is her real name, reportedly used over 80 different names, used 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers, and she basically just scammed the state out of any money she could get from them. She was the welfare queen. We're talking social security, food stamps, veteran benefits for these non-existent husbands, as well as just straight plain welfare, and the rumour went that she made $150,000 a year from doing this. At least that's the number that Ronald Reagan actually told people whilst he was running for president. Ronald Reagan's whole thing was that he was going to fix the welfare state that was broken at the time, so a lot of his talk when he was running for president was about this welfare queen. But what would Linda Taylor have to do with Paul Fronczak? Well, Linda Taylor had a history of kidnapping children. She lived in Chicago, and she apparently kidnapped one boy named Raymond Termini and his cousin Anna. Basically, Linda offered to babysit these children one day, and then she just refused to give them back. Eventually the parents do get them back, but she basically wanted these children so she could get more benefits. And apparently then one day in the 1960s, Linda turns up at her house with a newborn baby, and she hadn't been pregnant. Of course, it is very possible for a woman to give birth to a child showing no signs of pregnancy. It's something that definitely does happen. I've known people it's happened to. So you can't entirely write it off, but Linda just turns up at her home with this newborn baby boy, and she said that she'd given birth at Edgewater Hospital on December 13th, 1963. So this was 4 months before Paul was born. But the birth certificate saying this particular date was actually signed by a doctor who was known for signing fraudulent birth certificates and things, so you can't really take much from this. Apparently Linda also claimed to work in a hospital, although nobody actually ever saw her work in a hospital. She owned a nurse's hat, she owned a white uniform, and apparently on the day that Paul went missing, somebody saw Linda leaving her house wearing this uniform. Now, it's worth saying that whoever the police spoke to in regards to Linda Taylor, they didn't speak to them until many years later. And so memories are going to get a little bit distorted in that time. If these people have read a newspaper article about Paul Fronczak being taken by somebody in a nurse's uniform, they may just put 2 and 2 together all those years later and think that it was definitely Linda that did it, and so that's what they're telling the police. And that may well be the case, but I do just want to make it clear that nobody was spoken to until years later. Of course, at the time, in 1964, the police and the FBI did actually look into this possibility, but they couldn't get anywhere near Linda. Nobody close to her would speak to the police. Everyone was completely uncooperative, and so they kind of just had to let that one go to a dead end. And that's kind of where that lead ends. Linda's a very weird woman. She lived in Chicago. She was known to kidnap kids for welfare reasons. If she did take Paul, I don't think she has grown children now who could possibly be Paul. It's very, very strange. The police have looked into it, the private investigators I'm sure have looked into it, the FBI have looked into it, and that lead hasn't really gone anywhere, so I'd be more inclined to say that it isn't anything than it is. Paul says that he will remain Paul Fronczak until the moment he discovers the real Paul Fronczak, at which point he will hand over the birth certificate and then go claim his own birth certificate as Jack Rosenthal. Paul wrote a book about his experience called The Foundling, and he's still searching for answers to this day. He's got a whole website dedicated to his search, which is a really interesting read. I'll leave it linked down below if you want to go have a look. I just think this case is so interesting, and I think I'm probably going to round up there because I could keep talking for a while. If you know of any other cases similar to this in terms of genetics, then please let me know. Put them in the comments down below. I just think it's so fascinating because this kind of technology is so new. There are going to be so many people in the world that are about to discover that they're not who they think they are because of the new rise in popularity of these DNA tests. And I don't think this is going to be the last case we see that's along these lines. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to my channel if this is your kind of thing. I do this every single Wednesday. In the first line of the description will be the link to my big cartel store where I have now got new pins and new phone cases that I'm selling, so if you want to go check those out, that'll be linked down there. Thank you so much for watching. Bye guys.